Hello and welcome everybody. Oh my God, the participants keep coming. We're up to 102. Good for you for sticking it out through many hours of learning. Though I gotta say, this has just been a joy up till now. And my 11-month-old daughter has really been enjoying popping in and out of sessions. I was holding her up as Yaffa Epstein was teaching and saying, be like that, be like Yaffa. So it's good to be with you, and it's good to see the name of some old and new friends over in the participants list. Please do, as you were invited to already, add your questions and comments in the chat. This is definitely better when it's interactive. We are going to be talking for the next 50 minutes about my favorite medieval Jew, Rabbi Moses ben Maimon, aka Maimonides, aka the Rambam. If you don't have a favorite medieval Jew, you are more than welcome to adopt mine. He is a great many people's favorite medieval Jew, but as we're going to learn, there were some who definitely did not care for the work of Maimonides. We are going to talk about why it is that 30 years after Maimonides' death, his magnum opus, his Guide for the Perplexed, was burned by the rabbinic authorities in Provence. You would think people in Provence would have better things to do with their time than burn books, go to a nice restaurant, hang out and enjoy the lavender fields, but apparently not. And more interesting, frankly, is not why this book was burned 800 years ago, but why, if you walk into a traditional Beit Midrash anywhere in the world today, you are almost certain to find a copy of Maimonides' first major work, the Mishnah Torah, his massive compilation of all of the laws found in the Torah and the Talmud. But you are unlikely to find a copy of the Guide for the Perplexed sitting in a traditional Beit Midrash. And I want us to think about why this absolutely revered teacher, this name that virtually all educated or even semi-educated Jews know of Maimonides, why it is that his most important work was, and continues to be perhaps, primarily studied by Christian and Islamic intellectuals, by a small group of Jews, but is largely kept out of the Beit Midrash. I'm gonna share screen. Do I have ability to do that? Great, I'm gonna share screen and take us through a collection of texts that will hopefully start to answer some of these questions about who the Rambam was and what about his thought made it and continues to make it threatening to people. Great. So again, Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon, born 1135 in Cordoba, Spain, at the tail end of what's known as the golden age of Spanish Jewry, born into a relatively prosperous family. His grandfather was a rabbi. They were doing well in the very tolerant Muslim rule present in southern Spain up until his early teen years. In his teen years, there was a change of administration, a new group of particularly extremist Muslims coming in from North Africa called the Almohades, who end the golden age of Spain and make Spain no longer a place that Jews wanted to live. The Maimon family flees from Cordoba to Morocco, to Fez, where they live for a number of years. It is widely believed, though not definitively proven, that during at least a portion of this time, they lived publicly as Muslims while privately practicing Judaism, a sort of foretaste of the conversos that would later come about because of the Spanish Inquisition 300 years later. They left Morocco, went briefly to Israel, but did not stay in Israel, ultimately settled in the Jewish suburb of Cairo, which was called Fustat, where Maimonides grew up to fulfill every dream of every Jewish mother twice over. He becomes both a doctor and a rabbi. Not only does he become a doctor, he becomes the doctor to Saladin, to the Sultan of Egypt, taking care of the Sultan and his wives and children and his court. not only does he become a rabbi, he becomes the rabbi of Fustat, overseeing one of the major Jewish centers of his era. And in his downtime, he writes the most important work of Jewish law and the most important work of Jewish philosophy ever composed. He was a very, very busy man. In fact, we have a letter from Maimonides in which he describes his weekly schedule, describing himself taking care of his medical duties in the royal court 6 days a week, on Shabbat serving as the community rabbi, at Shabbat afternoon taking to his bed, and various people who had rabbinic questions would come to him and he would answer them while laying down so as not to further exhaust himself, and then staying up at night by candlelight to write his works of law and philosophy. It is maybe not surprising that we know absolutely nothing, not even her name, about Mrs. Rambam, because while he did have a wife and children, did not seem to have much energy left over for family ties. He dies in 1204 in Cairo, leaving behind a wealth of thought, not just these two major works that we're going to talk about, the Mishnah Torah and the Moreh Nevuchim, the Guide for the Perplexed, but a collection of truly incredible letters and essays, including one that's very, very dear to me. I, in my regular work, direct the Miller Introduction to Judaism program, which is the largest program in North America helping people convert to Judaism. Maimonides is responsible for a famous letter to a man named Ovadia Hager, Ovadia the convert, in which he rules that somebody who is not born Jewish but converts to Judaism should be treated in every way like a Jew. In response to the question that Ovadia asked him, which was, am I allowed to say Eloheinu v'Elohei Avotenu, God and God of my ancestors, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, when they are not my lineal ancestors? And Rambam responds back to him and says, by the act of conversion, they become your parents and grandparents. And so don't think of yourself as in any way less than anybody who has genetic, so to speak, Jewish heritage. So he leaves us with an incredible treasure trove of writings that continue to be fodder for Jewish learning today. His first major work, however, was the Mishnah Torah, which he completed in his early 30s as a way of making us all feel really bad about ourselves and what we've accomplished. This is a copy of the first volume of the Mishnah Torah. Yes, the first volume is called Hilchot Yesodei HaTorah, the laws of the foundations of Torah. And as we're going to see, this first volume really constitutes a first draft to his longer philosophic work, which he picks up after completing the Mishnah Torah in his mid-30s, so that he has something to do with the rest of his life. The Mishnah Torah accomplishes something which had never been done before, which was to take all of the laws in the Torah, all 613 mitzvot, all of the many times that number of halachot, of laws in the Talmud and in other writings, and to compile them down into one singular code that you could look into and get the answer to any Jewish question that you might have, at least any question of Jewish law. This had never been done before. It's never been done as completely or as beautifully since. The Mishnah Torah runs through not only all of the laws of day-to-day Jewish practice, how to keep kosher, how to keep Shabbat, it also includes laws about things like how parents and children ought to relate to one another and what good government ought to look like. You remember good government. It includes laws for how we ought to live after the Messiah has come, and it includes philosophical reflections that are not quite laws, but really are the process of him trying to think out an overall structure for how this Jewish system hangs together and what it is rooted in. In his introduction to the Mishnah Torah, which literally means second Torah, Maimonides writes, if you read the first Torah, which was written by God, and the second Torah, which is written by me, you don't need to read any other Jewish books. He had a substantial ego, being both a doctor and a rabbi, both professions known for attracting people with substantial egos. And I think the combination of the two and being, a genius, an actual certified genius, made him probably no fun to live with. But he's kind of right. If you read the first Torah written by God and the second Mishnah Torah written by him, you at least do know the basics of everything Jewish. That's why his famous epitaph on his tomb in Tiberias says, "From Moses to Moses, there was none like Moses." And it's true. He completes the Mishnah Torah and he moves on to spend the rest of his life working on his magnum opus, the Guide for the Perplexed, the More Nevuchim. Until I got to college, I had heard of the Guide for the Perplexed, though I had never opened it up. I always imagined it was sort of an introduction to Judaism set of books, Judaism for dummies, perhaps. If you're perplexed about why we light 2 Shabbos candles, open up the Guide for the Perplexed. And then I encountered my teacher, Rabbi Chaim Seidler-Feller, for 40 years, the rabbi of UCLA Hillel, and a great devotee of Maimonides. I'm sure a teacher to many of us on this call, who taught me really to revere Rambam, and who taught me that the Guide for the Perplexed is not going to make you less perplexed about anything. It is simply going to open up deeper and deeper worlds of questions that you never even knew you had. The real perplexity that Maimonides is addressing in the guide is the perplexity that might arise in the mind of a young Jewish person who went to a university and studied the works of Plato and Aristotle and the other classical philosophers, and came back to the synagogue and said, "Since I have the Greeks, what do I need with Torah?" The reason why he wrote this book at the particular time and place that he wrote it was that while Europe was in the middle of the Dark Ages and had forgotten about the works of the classical world, the Arabic-speaking world, the Muslim world, where Maimonides lived, continued to revere the Greek and Roman masters. They continued to teach and study their works, particularly the work of Aristotle, and there were a small group of Jewish families that were able to send their kids to those Arabic-speaking universities, whose kids were coming back and saying, "Mom, Dad, I don't think I want to be Jewish anymore because I'm now a student of the Greeks." In a lot of ways, this challenge that he was responding to feels very prescient to our own times from 800 years ago. In a world in which most Jews pursue undergraduate and many Jews pursue graduate education, the question of what continued relevance does Judaism have for those of us who have studied world wisdom? And his attempt in the guide is to make an integration, to make a shiluv in Hebrew, an integration between the thought of Aristotle and the thought of the Torah, between the world of science and philosophy and the world of religion. 2 worlds which we continue to debate whether they can be in conversation with one another or coexist with one another. For Maimonides, living 800 years ago, these 2 worlds had to be in conversation with one another and had to coexist with one another. And the things that he says in the Guide for the Perplexed, many of them are earth-shaking. They are daring and chutzpahdik and challenging even for religious people today. We're going to look at a number of different passages from both Yesodei HaTorah, his rough draft for the guide, and from the guide itself. And I hope that as we look through them, you will feel with me their freshness and their relevance and their chutzpah. And I hope that by the end of this session, for those who are newer to Maimonides study, that you will have your appetite whetted to dive deeper into his incredible writings, which I believe chart such an essential path forward for us as 21st century Jews. So we're gonna start digging into some text. Sorry. Here we go. We're going to start with a text from Yesodei HaTorah. As I said, this is the first book of the Mishnah Torah, really functions as a preliminary draft to the guide. In many ways, the passage that we are going to read now is expanded to the entirety of volume 1 of the guide. Of the 3 volumes of the guide, virtually all of volume 1 is dedicated to this question. Rather than present you with pages and pages of text, I'm giving you just a paragraph or 2. That's why I'm giving it to you from the Mishnah Torah. Behold, it is explicitly stated in the Torah and the works of the prophets that the Holy One, blessed be he, is not confined to a body or physical form. I'm going to recognize and name the irony, by the way, of using male pronouns in a discussion about God having no physical form. And then I'm going to continue to do that because it's going to be simpler. But I want to assure you that Maimonides did not think of God in anthropomorphic male terms, and I don't either. The Holy One, blessed be he, is not confined to a body or physical form, as Deuteronomy states, because God, your Lord, is the Lord of heavens above and earth below. And a body can't exist in 2 places simultaneously. Very clever philosophical proof. The Torah says God is in heaven and of the earth's below, and a body can only be at one place in time. You cannot dance at 2 weddings with 1 tuchus, though you can now zoom into 2 weddings. So I think we're going to need a new expression. God can't be like a body because God is in multiple places. In fact, God is everywhere all at once. If this is so, what is the meaning of expressions employed by the Torah like below God's feet, or written by the finger of God, or God's hand, or God's eyes, or God's ears, and the like? The Torah seems to treat God as a physical body, as a being who walks in the garden at the breezy time of day and encounters Adam and Eve. God is the one who redeemed us from Egypt with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. God is described in extremely anthropomorphic language throughout our biblical texts. Maimonides is saying, God doesn't have a body, God doesn't have a form. How do we understand these many references to God having body parts? He answers, all these expressions were used to relate to human thought processes, which know only corporeal imagery. For, and this is a very important phrase, Torah dibra b'lashon b'nei Adam. The Torah speaks in the language of human beings. This is one of Maimonides' critical points, and it is on its surface something which doesn't seem altogether controversial, but actually interrogated a little bit further is remarkably heretical. What is Maimonides saying here? Maimonides is saying that the Torah isn't actually describing objective reality, at least it's not describing objective reality as it pertains to God. Instead, the Torah is painting a picture and telling a story in language that we can understand in maybe an equivalent way to the way that I might explain something to my young child. If that's the case, if the Torah is painting a picture in our language but is not describing an objective reality, then that opens up a remarkable theological can of worms in which we can't be sure in any case when the Torah is meant to be taken literally and when it's meant to be taken figuratively. If the Torah is written in the language of human beings, not in the language of objective reality, then everything is subject to interpretation. And while I'd imagine for a Limmud crowd, we all know that everything is subject to interpretation, there is a whole wide religious world out there that believes if the Bible says it, it's the truth. This tiny passage challenges that whole concept that the Bible speaks in a true language, at least if true means pertaining to objective reality. And furthermore, if the Bible is painting a metaphorical picture when it's talking about God having an arm or eyes or ears, we need to extend that further if we're going to be honest and recognize that some major characteristics that we associate with the divinity are also equally impossible for a being which is not anthropomorphic. So we probably believe that God doesn't have literal eyes like we have eyes, or ears like we have ears. We are probably comfortable with the idea that when God redeemed us from Egypt, it wasn't with a strong arm, like an arm with many biceps. I guess you only have one bicep, but it can be bigger or smaller. An arm with giant biceps. We're probably comfortable with that level of rejecting anthropomorphism. But Maimonides tells us we've got to go further. Since it's been clarified that he does not have a body or corporeal form, it's also clear that none of the functions of the body are appropriate to him. Neither connection nor separation, neither place nor measure, neither ascent nor descent, right nor left, front nor back, standing or sitting. Meaning, if God isn't a physical being instantiated in space, then it is impossible to say God is there but not there. A physical being in space occupies a discrete location, and there are locations that are not that being. For Maimonides, if God is not a body, then God has no physical place or measure. There are no dimensions that are relevant to God, up or down, right or left, front or back. This seems quite close to the sort of panentheism, the sort of belief of God being everywhere and everything that we much more often associate with Kabbalah, with Jewish mysticism. In fact, the Zohar is being written down about 100 years after this is written down. And while we often think of Maimonides and the mystics as natural opponents of one another, this passage and some of the others that we're going to look at suggest that they may have more of an affinity than we usually give them credit for. So God is not to be found in space, meaning that God is everywhere, not anywhere in particular. And furthermore, God is not found within time, so that he would possess a beginning, an end, or age. He does not change, for there is nothing that can cause him to change. Of course, change is a measure of how things evolve or progress over time. If God is not in the timeline, then God has no capacity to change. The concept of death is not applicable to God, take that, Nietzsche, nor is the concept of life within the physical concept of life. Foolishness is not applicable to him, nor is that of wisdom in terms of human wisdom. See, he's doing subtle things here, and you say, of course God can't die. And then the next sentence is, but by the way, remember, that means that God isn't alive either. Of course God isn't foolish. But remember, if God's not foolish, remember, that means that God's not wise either. So we all of a sudden have a God who no longer lives in heaven, who no longer changes and evolves, who isn't dead, but also isn't alive, who isn't foolish, but also can't be described, at least in the wisdom terms that we are familiar with describing wisdom. Neither sleeping nor waking, neither anger nor laughter, neither joy nor sadness, neither silence nor speech, in the human understanding of speech, are appropriate terms with which to describe God. Wow, 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 wow. This God who doesn't exist in space, this God who doesn't exist in time, this same God can't have emotions, according to Maimonides. God can't be happy, and God can't be sad. God can't get angry, and God can't be appeased. God doesn't keep silent, and God doesn't speak. The single most repeated phrase in the whole Torah, Vayomer Adonai el Moshe lemor, and God says to Moses, every single one of those need to be understood by Maimonides as the Torah speaking in human language. God didn't say anything to Moses because God doesn't speak. If we extend that out, if we really think about what that means, that the Torah isn't true in the literal sense of true, and that God's revelation doesn't come in the form of words, then everything that we know about religion is up for grabs. Everything that we know about religion needs to be questioned and scrutinized. And this is not coming from some crazy, radical 21st century voice. This is coming from Maimonides, from a great medieval Jew of 800 years ago. I want to pause here and take a look in the chat because I see many chats coming up.
Adam, one thing that was identified earlier on was looking for your advice for a good translation.
Great. The Mishnah Torah is available on Sefaria with an excellent translation, so available to everybody. And if you like hard copy books as I do, then I have the translation that was done by Rabbi Eliyahu Toger, Touger, and a nice set by Mosnaim Publishing. The Guide for the Perplexed was written not in Hebrew, but in Arabic. And so there are fewer available translations because I guess there are fewer people translating from the Arabic Jewish philosophy. The gold standard translation is by a professor from Hebrew University, Shlomo. His last name is spelled P-I-N-E-S, which should translate or should be pronounced as Shlomo Pines, but apparently in his life he was insistent on being called Shlomo Penis. And I think that shows that academics are very smart in some areas and perhaps lacking in other areas. The Shlomo, I'm going to call him Pines, translation is excellent. There are some other translations available. And if you're interested in studying the guide, it is helpful to study it along with a secondary source. So I think somebody here gave a shout out to their dad's book, Maimonides' Guide for the Perplexed, a philosophical guide. That's on my shelf. Thank you, Rebecca. Tell your dad Yasher Koach for me. I love the skinny book called A Guide for Today's Perplexed by a professor at University of Chicago, whose name is escaping me at the moment, but it's called A Guide for Today's Perplexed. It's a great book to be following along. A number of questions here about if God isn't all these things, what does God define God as? If God doesn't listen, how do we have a relationship? How do we pray to a God like this? Yeah, all of these are really good questions. These are not things that I can necessarily answer in this context. I think we would have to ask Maimonides how he davened to a God like this. I think it's very challenging to pray to Maimonides' God, because Maimonides' God isn't a parent in the sky who's going to take care of us. Maimonides' God is something radically, radically other. And so I don't think it's impossible to seek to connect with that sort of spiritual force, what in Christian thought is often talked about as the ground of being. That's the term from Reinhold Niebuhr or Paul Tillich. But praying to the ground of being, praying to the intellect of the universe, praying to the force which makes possible salvation in Kaplan's terms. Mordechai Kaplan was deeply influenced by the Rambam and the creation of Reconstructionist Judaism. All of these require a significant shift, if not in the liturgy itself, certainly in the way that we are thinking about liturgy and who we feel that we're addressing. All right, I'm gonna press on with some other texts. All right, so yesterday HaTorah is the rough draft of him working out who this kind of God is. By the time he gets to the guide, he has fully committed to the idea of a God who is fundamentally non-anthropomorphic and completely other than anything we can imagine. So much so that he writes in the guide that this is actually the only proper God to believe in. I'm going to read this out loud, and you're going to get why he pissed some people off, not just with his philosophy, but with his style. If it should occur to you that one who believes in the corporeality of God should be excused because of his having brought up in this doctrine, or because of his ignorance and the shortness of his apprehension, you ought to hold a similar belief with regard to an idolater, for he only worships idols because of his ignorance or upbringing. Stop, wait, do you notice? God, Rambam just said, if you believe that God loves you, you're an idolater. And of course, are then subject to the penalties that Rambam would hold for idolatry, which is ideally execution. If you believe that God listens to you with an ear, and you believe that God speaks, you are committing a form of idol worship, says Maimonides. That idolatry isn't fundamentally about praying to a statue. That's a very simplistic view of idol worship. Idolatry is fundamentally about taking a really big God and making him small. Taking that God and shrinking that God down into human terms. That's fundamentally what's prohibited by the second commandment. If, however, you would say that the pshat, the external sense of the biblical text, causes men to fall into doubt, you should know that an idolater is similarly impelled to his idolatry by imaginings and defective representations. Accordingly, there is no excuse for one who does not accept the authority of men who inquire into the truth. Meaning, if you take the Torah literally, you're also an idolater. That God can be very easily turned into an idol by shrinking God down into human terms, that the Torah can be turned into an idol by imagining it to be literally true. Whoa, whoa, whoa. I do not consider as an infidel one who cannot demonstrate that the corporeality of God should be negated. But I do consider as an infidel anyone who does not believe its negation. You don't have to be able to get here on your own. You don't have to be able to reinterpret Torah to understand this non-corporeal God. But he says, you got to trust me on this one. If you believe in the faith that you've always been taught was Torah true, you are actually in violation of one of the Torah's most essential commandments. This is enough to get his book burned and certainly left off of the shelf of the Beit Midrash. And it's part of the reason why we have to study Maimonides. We have to study Maimonides because even if we don't agree with him, even if we think he goes too far, even if we say, I can't possibly pray to this God and I need a God who will hold me in difficult times, this is not my faith. We need to at least reckon, with the questions that he raises. We need to at least have an answer for what does it mean to think of God in nuanced terms that don't take the Torah literally but take it seriously. We need to be able to think about God as being fundamentally different than the God who is so often captured in children's stories. I'm thinking of a beautiful poem from Rilke, who says something like, over and over we try to paint you, O God, and we hide you with our painting. If only we could set down our brushes and our paint and just love you. That it is in imagining a God who is like us. It is in believing or thinking we have to believe that the Torah is literally true, that we actually hide God from ourselves. Here's another passage. Another one of the questions that Maimonides takes up, in addition to questions of theology, is he takes up the question of law. What makes law binding? Now, we might think that the traditional answer is what makes law binding is that it came from the mouth of the Holy One. Except, of course, God doesn't speak in words. So God can't command anything from God's non-existent mouth. And if you believe God did, see previous statement, you're an infidel and an idolater. Therefore, for Maimonides, there has to be a fundamental rationality to the mitzvot. He says, well, I'll just summarize the first paragraph as that. Torah has to be rational. There has to be a reason for the mitzvot. And then he says in the second paragraph, get this, there's a group of human beings who consider it a grievous thing that causes should be given for any law. What would please them most is that the intellect would not find a meaning for the commandments and prohibitions. The 20th century Jewish philosopher Yeshayahu Leibovitz says some version of this. He says, if you keep kosher because you think that it's a cleaner or more healthy diet, you don't keep kosher. The only reason to keep kosher is obedience to God. And furthermore, if you do anything or refrain from doing anything that the Torah commands you to do or not do for any other reason other than that you are a good obedient servant, then you are serving your own mind and your own conscience rather than God. Maimonides says, what compels them to feel thus is a sickness that they find in their souls, a sickness to which they are unable to give utterance and of which they cannot furnish a satisfactory account. For they think that if those laws were useful in this existence and had been given to us for this or that reason, it would be as if they derived from the reflection and understanding of some other intelligent being. That the pursuit of understanding why we have the mitzvot is not just possible, it's necessary. And the idea of do it because I told you to, do it because you are commanded to do it, and cease your inquiry there, is a giving up of what is fundamentally our human responsibility toward the mitzvot. We are required to inquire. It's demanded of us that we take these mitzvot seriously, not just as dictates from a divine king, but as meaningful and rational guides for how to live. That also poses significant challenge to halachic authorities in his time and since, who would have us be loyal to tradition for tradition's sake, who would have us follow the mitzvot because they are commanded of us. It is not for us to wonder why, it's just for us to do or die. Rambam says, absolutely not. And that attitude constitutes a sickness of the soul. I see I've got about 10 minutes left and a bunch of other texts, and I do want to address some questions which are piling up in the chat. Let's just look at one other thing. And I'll put a link in the chat in a moment where you can download this, this whole presentation, because you should see some of the other texts. Maimonides takes up the question of why bad things happen to good people. We tend to think that until Harold Kushner came along and wrote his bestseller, that religious people were obligated to believe that everything that happens to us is a function of the divine plan, and that only got turned on its head in the last few decades by modern thinkers who say some version of God is not ultimately responsible for deciding who gets cancer and who does not. God is not the author of COVID or any other tragedy. God is with us and in those who are struggling against COVID and other tragedies. We tend to think of that as modern thought. Here, a passage from 800 years ago. The numerous evils to which individual persons are exposed are due to defects existing in persons themselves. We complain and seek relief from our own faults. We suffer from the evils which we, by our own free will, inflict on ourselves and ascribe them to God, who is far from being connected to them. This is explained by Solomon, who says, "The foolishness of man distorts his way, and his heart frets against God." He says here, the things that happen in your life, they are not the fault of God. They're not even connected to God. Instead, the evils which befall us are of three kinds. The first kind of evil is that which is caused to man by the circumstance that he possesses a body. In accordance with divine wisdom, Genesis can only take place through destruction, and without the destruction of the individual members of the species themselves would vanish. Why do we get sick? Because we're made of stuff, and stuff breaks. Why do we die? Because the only way that the crops can grow is if the previous generation become mulch for them, And while we don't like to think of ourselves in similar terms to the plants in the field, the truth is we are mortal, because if we were not, there would be no beginnings and no endings of new life. Life would stop. Death isn't a punishment decreed by God in a book of life and a book of death, signed on Rosh Hashanah and sealed on Yom Kippur. Death is simply a function of being embodied in the world. The second class of evils comprises such evils as people cause to each other. When some of them use their strengths against others. These evils are more numerous than the first kind, and their causes are numerous and known. They likewise originate in ourselves, though the sufferer himself cannot avert them. Some things that are bad that happen to us happen because we're made of stuff, and stuff breaks. Some things that happen that are bad to us is that we are given free will, and some of us use it to raise each other up, and some of us use it to break each other down. And that has nothing to do with God and everything to do with us. And the third class of evils comprise those of which everyone causes to himself by his own action. This is the largest class. It is especially of these evils that all men complain. Only a few men are found which do not sin against themselves by this kind of evil. When they thus meet with the consequences of the course which they adopt, they complain of the degrees and judgments of God. What is he talking about here? He's talking about if you eat a lot of fatty food and you don't exercise, and you have a heart attack, you can't blame God. And if you smoke packs of cigarettes and you get lung cancer, you can't blame God. And if you go bungee jumping and the bungee cord snaps, you should have listened to your mother and not gone bungee jumping. These are not acts of God. This is simply what we do to ourselves. And projecting then the things that we do to ourselves and complaining against God, oh, how could you do this to me, is absurd, according to Maimonides. So a whole theology in which good are given good and bad are given bad, in which if we do the right thing, the rains will come at the proper time, and we will have grain and wine and oil. That's the second paragraph of the Shema. The whole idea that God is running the show and giving out reward and punishment, Maimonides dismisses as simply Narishkeit. He didn't speak Yiddish, but it's clearly Narishkeit. Why did we get sick? Why do bad things happen? Because we're made of stuff, and we're often unkind to each other, and we don't watch what we eat. And if we were a little bit better in the last category, the two last categories, we could do a little bit better. There's nothing we can do about the fact that we're made of stuff. Anyway, I want to pause here and take some questions.
Adam, would you like my help in sifting through?
Oh yeah, if you've got something, give me.
There's a lot in here. I mean, I feel like we want to have a whole course on Rambam with you. I particularly am enjoying all your humor thrown in there. One thought that I thought was really interesting, this question on what your take, which I assume is also Rambam's take on Naaseh v'nishma.
So Naaseh v'nishma is what we said to God at the base of Mount Sinai. We will act and we will understand. That knowledge leads to action, that action leads to understanding rather than the other way around. It's a great question. I am racking my brain to try to think if I can remember what he specifically says on Naaseh v'nishma, and I don't specifically remember. So I won't presume to put words in the great man's mouth. I will say that Maimonides insists that you do your intellectual homework before coming to live the religious life, or at least in parallel to it. And one who lives the religious life without doing their intellectual homework, well, it's not quite good enough. Here, I'll just point out this text, which we won't have time to talk about in detail, but it comes to the second to last chapter of the guide. It's called The Parable of the Palace. The palace in parable is always heaven. The king is always God. And he says there are different levels of access to the palace. Those who desire to arrive at the palace and to enter it, but who have not yet seen it, meaning those who are in the outer courtyards but can't get through the bouncer at the front door, are the mass of religious people, the multitude that observe the divine commandments but are ignorant. Those who arrive at the palace but go round about it are those who devote themselves exclusively to the study of practical law. They believe traditionally in true principles of faith and learn the practical worship of God, but are not trained in philosophical treatment of law and do not endeavor to establish the truth of their faith. A person who is a good yid, who keeps kosher, who keeps Shabbos, who prays 3 times a day, the closest they can get to God, says Rambam, is the outer courtyard of the palace. The key to getting in to the presence of God is the intellectual work that's being described here. Now, for this reason, many Jews have been profoundly offended by Maimonides' writing, even to the point of burning it or banning it. Because he says to be a good Jew is simply not enough. So I don't have a specific answer to this really good and worthy question, though I know what I'm going to be studying for myself the next chance I get. But I will say that simply doing the actions, what Heschel might have called religious behaviorism, is from Maimonides definitively not enough if the goal is actually to have true knowledge and true intimacy with the divine.
Wonderful. Well, I appreciate your attitude of always learning, Adam. Amazing response. And also really appreciate the comments. I mean, we just don't have the time to dive into these really meaty thoughts and questions that everyone's bringing. And I would say in the true nature of Limmud, we don't want to stop learning. A lot of people are eager to study your sources, Adam. So if you have the ability to put it into the chat before we end, that would be wonderful. And people want to learn with you.